Hi, and welcome to a tutorial on JavaScript. Today is part 3 of the loop tutorial. We will be discussing the for loop. The for loop is different from the do while and while loop because where we declare the variable for our incrementer, where we create the conditions for the loop to occur, and where we increment the incrementer variable all happen on the same line. I will demonstrate this to you as we go through this video. That way you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So to start off our tutorial, we're going to create a function, and that function name is for loop. Inside that function, we're going to create a variable output. We're going to equal that to an empty string. Now going to create our for loop by writing the word for. Inside of our parentheses, the first thing we need to do is create our incrementer variable, which is I. And we need to equal that to 1. Then we need to put a semicolon. After the semicolon, we put the conditions that have to be met for the loop to occur. Because we are doing what I have been doing in the previous videos for loops, we need to make the conditions I less than or equal to 10. Now remember, in the last videos, I am creating a loop to go from 1 to 10 and print the numbers 1 to 10 on the screen. So that is why we need I to be less than or equal to 10. We then place another semicolon to make separations between what is going on, and we now need to increment our incrementer value. We simply do this by doing an I++. This says add 1 to I each time the code happens. The for loop is a little bit tricky when it comes to this, so you got to be careful of where you're putting the plus plus. If you put the plus plus on the left side of the I, this means increment I by 1 before the loop code occurs. So that means before you get into the code, it increments by 1. So in this case, I equals 1, it would equal 2 before the code starts. We don't want that to happen. We want to use the plus plus on the right side of the I. What this says is execute the loop, then increment the incrementer by 1. So it would go through the loop, and then it would say add 1 to I, so it would make it 2. And then it would go through the loop again, and then it would add 1 to I. Now, since we want to display 1 to 10 on the screen, we need to set the output variable plus equals I plus a line break inside of a string. So what this is saying is each time that the loop happens, increment I by 1 and stick it into the string of output, and then create a line break so that each time that this occurs, the value is put onto a separate line. We now need to display this to the user. We're going to do this outside of the for loop. We simply do this by using the HTML JavaScript DOM, which is simply the code document.getElementById. The ID that we're going to use is for loop. Inner HTML equals, and we want to display the output variable to the user, because that is where all the values are being stored as it increments. We now need to come down to the body, and we need to create a button. We need to give it a type equals button. After that, we need to give it an event handler. The event handler that we want is going to be onClick. When somebody clicks the button, we want the for loop function to execute. We need to give that button a value. We're going to give it a value of click me. Now that we have the button set up, underneath of that, we need to create a div where the output will display to the user on the screen. We're going to give this the value of what we have up here in the document.getElement by ID, which is for loop. We need to close that div. You can go ahead and save the file, refresh the page. As you can see, we now have a click me button. Now, before I click the button, I'm going to step you through what is happening with this code. So the first thing that we do is we come to this page, we click the button. As we click the button, the JavaScript event handler says execute the function for loop. So it comes up to this function for loop and it executes it. It creates a variable called output and sets that equal to an empty string. It then goes and creates a for loop. Inside of the parentheses, we create a variable I and we set that equal to 1. We then, after the semicolon, create the conditions on when the loop will execute. So the code will execute when I is less than or equal to 10. We then have a semicolon separating the incrementer. The incrementer then adds 1 each time the loop is executed, and then goes into the code and it puts the value of I plus line break into the string variable output. And it goes through this each time until the conditions aren't met. So the first time that it goes through the loop, it sets a variable I equal to 1, goes through the loop, increments by 1 at the end of the loop, comes back up, checks the condition as I less than equal to 10. So at that case, the second time it runs through, 2 is what I is equal to. So 2 is less than 10, so it goes through and executes the code again, increments the I by 1. So now I equals 3. 3 is less than or equal to 10, so it goes through the loop again until I is not less than or equal to 10. And when I is not less than or equal to 10, the loop stops. It then comes down and executes this function, which says go to the HTML, find the ID for loop, and in that element, place the variable output, or the information that we stored in the variable output. So if we hit the click me button, as you can see, it did not work, which means we need to go in and figure out why. Unexpected token. And as you can see, I think I have too many tokens. Oh, that needs to be a semicolon. Go ahead and save this file again. And what I just did is actually an example of debugging. As a coder, you will always be debugging your code. I promise you, you'll make simple mistakes and you'll have to debug until you find those simple mistakes. Some of them will be complex mistakes, but you'll have to use debugging to find those mistakes. But back to our topic of for loops, let's go ahead and click the button, click me. And once again, it's not working. For loop is not defined. And that is happening on line 16. And that is because, as you can see right here, we have for loop with a capital L, and I have for loop down here with a lowercase l. So that needs to be a capital L. Once again, this is an example of debugging. Even though it was a simple mistake, you still had to debug to find it. Let's refresh the page. Let's hit the click me. Now 1 is displayed, which means we need to go back to our code and figure out only why 1 was displayed. It's because it should be I less than equal 10, output plus equals I plus BR. And that is because we need the close the break. I'm going to go ahead and save that and refresh, hit click me, and as you can see, the code now executed. So in closing, I have discussed with you the for loop. For loop differs from the do while and while loop because inside of the parentheses, you're not only going to have the condition that has to be met for the code to execute, or for the loop to execute, you're also going to declare the incrementer variable, and you're going to increment the incrementer variable. Thank you for watching.